Hey guys, so today we're going to be looking at ways to increase the fresh water supply and why it's necessary to go ahead and think about increasing the availability of fresh water supply. We'll continue to work on this a little later as we start looking at pollution and water treatment with respect to fresh water, but this is our place to go ahead and get started. So let's jump right in. Number one, what are the harmful effects of aquifer depletion? We introduced you to aquifers last time. Today, we need to go ahead and discuss what's happening. The San Joaquin River is just one example of this aquifer depletion. Number two, what are the benefits and problems associated with dams and reservoirs? Here in the Pacific Northwest, we definitely have dams that we're dealing with when we start looking at the Columbia River, when we start looking at the Snake River. And what are the benefits of those dams, but what are the drawbacks as well? And number three, what are the problems associated with water transfer and desalination? All right. So, daily water use. You took your water footprint a little earlier in this class. And according to the American Water Works Association, the average American directly uses about 261 liters or about 69 gallons of fresh water every day. That's every single day. That's enough to fill about two bathtubs. Okay? Now, some of that is not actually used in the way that we think of in a positive way. Some of it is wasted in terms of leaks, running faucets, excess water due to taking showers, flushing toilets, washing clothes. So there's a lot of lost water in that process. Now, most of the water we use each day is virtual water. Okay, so that's not included in those previous numbers. This is the water used to make the fabrics that you wear for clothes, make the products that you consume, the food that you eat, the drinks that you consume. And so, if you take a look, we talked about this last class, but here's just more examples of that virtual water. How many bathtubs full of water is needed to go ahead and produce, say, a cup of coffee? Now, remember, bathtubs, not cups. Okay. Hamburger. Then we got to start looking at non-food related things. Last class, we only really looked at food related things. T-shirt, 17 bathtubs. Blue jeans, 72 bathtubs. Small car, 2,600 bathtubs of water to produce a small car. Medium-sized house, about 16,000 bathtubs worth of water. That's a lot of water. So we have to start thinking about our water usage, not just in terms of what we drink or what we flush or what we go ahead and brush our teeth with, but in every single decision that we make in terms of what we consume, right? There are three major river basins in the Middle East. And as we saw last class, we are using available fresh water unsustainably by wasting, polluting it, and charging too little for this irreplaceable natural resource. And this is not just in the United States, but this is a worldwide issue. And so we're starting to look at issues across the globe of water scarcity. So I wanted to go over a case study of the Middle East because this is one of the areas that's going to be most heavily impacted by water scarcity. Water shortages in the Middle East produce what is known hydrological poverty. This is essentially not having enough available water. And there are three major river basins in the Middle East: the Nile River, the Jordan River, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Those are the ones that are in what was Babylon, okay, mostly in like Iraq. And so far, there have been some fairly peaceful problem solving if we start thinking about pre 2010. But in more recent years, it's becoming more fierce because more and more people are beginning to realize that this is becoming a scarce resource. Now, we have to remember that only 3% of the water on our planet is actually fresh water, and most of that is not available to us. We get fresh water from both groundwater and surface water. Surface water is a combination of our watershed, right? Everyone lives downstream. It's our surface runoff. And we focus on that generally reliable runoff because we are having fewer and fewer of these wet years due to climate change. But the numbers suggest that one of every six people does not have sufficient access to clean water. And this situation will almost certainly get worse as time goes on. So, what do we need to do to increase water supplies? One of our biggest problems right now is exactly what we're talking about when we go ahead and take a look at the San Joaquin River in our Apocalypse River blog. Aquifers are being depleted. We are over pumping. We are using the water faster than it can be replaced. And so you get stretches of these major rivers like the San Joaquin, like the Colorado, that are running out of water, at least temporarily. And most of that water is used to irrigate crops because we grow a lot of our food in areas that are fairly dry and not really conducive on their own to growing the crops that we grow there. So, overpumping is going to limit our food production, raise our food prices, and widen the gap between the rich and the poor. Now, last class we also discussed how much of our drinking water comes from groundwater. Withdrawing large amounts from groundwater can actually cause the land to collapse. This is what's known as subsidence, when the land above an aquifer subsides or sinks. Once an aquifer becomes compressed by subsidence, you can't recharge it. I mean, that is a dead aquifer. It is no longer going to hold water. This is what you saw in some of those sections of the San Joaquin when Sutter is holding up his shovel so that you can see where the land used to be versus where it is now. That's how much dropped because it collapsed and crushed the aquifer. That's subsidence. And this is not just the impossibility of putting water back in it, but this can also damage roadways, water and sewer lines, and the foundations beneath buildings. There are several different types of subsidence. Um, the ones up above here, oil and natural gas extraction can cause it. You can get it from mining. You can get it from limestone breaking down. But the one we're focusing on right now is the groundwater related subsidence. As we deplete the aquifer, there's no longer that pressure to hold it up, and you see a collapse of the ground. Okay. This is a problem in the United States too, not just in Saudi Arabia. If we start thinking about the central United States, we are already beginning to overdraft our groundwater. Okay, you start looking at some sections of California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, uh, Colorado, these drier sections. And you can walk along these waterways to see how bad this is. Turns out that water levels in the Oglala aquifer, which is the one kind of highlighted here on the right, going through Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, and they have seen huge declines as you get to the southern end because water is being pulled out in the upper reaches of the river, making less and less available downstream, leading to increased aquifer depletion and hopefully not, but getting closer to potential subsidence. This is natural capital degradation of the world's largest known aquifer. So it's something we need to be aware of, and we need to do something to make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, when you overpump, you can end up drawing salt water into these freshwater aquifers, and that's going to make the water undrinkable and unusable for irrigation. This is especially risky when you start looking at places that are closer to the oceans. California is a great example of this. And yes, we can convert salty ocean water into fresh water through a process known as desalination, but it's expensive. And the brine that results of all the leftover salt must be disposed of somewhere. And you can't dump it back in the ocean, even though you're thinking, oh, it's salt water, because it changes the amount of salt. If you remember your biology days, due to osmosis and diffusion, salt doesn't typically go through membranes. And so an unbalance in the amount of salt versus the cells of the aquatic animals can cause huge problems in terms of their survival. And so, how can we dispose of it without harming the aquatic or terrestrial ecosystems? Now, there are two types of desalination: what we call distillation, which is essentially boiling the water off and condensing the water vapor, or reverse osmosis, which is essentially a microfiltration. We push the water through an osmotic filter. It blocks the salt from going through the filter, and then you have fresh water on the other side. But in both cases, you're left with all of that extra salt. What do you do with it? And this is a problem we're going to see more and more of as the number of saltwater plants, these desalination plants, is growing tremendously. Currently, there are over 15,000 plants worldwide in over 125 countries, with Saudi Arabia having the most at least 27 at last check. Okay. But there are costs to the rate at which we're using water. And it's not just the need to rely on things like desalination. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union undertook a major water diversion project on the arid plains of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. The region's two major rivers, which are fed by snowmelt and precipitation in faraway mountains, were used to transform the desert into farms for cotton and other crops. And while at first glance that thing's like, oh, that's boosting the economy, this sounds like a great idea, it led to the shrinking of the Aral Sea. Now, before the project, the Sirdarya and the Amudarya rivers flowed down from the mountains, cut northwest through the, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, Kizil Kum Desert, and finally pooled together in the lowest part of the basin. The lake they made, the Aral Sea, was once the fourth largest lake or sea in the entire world, the inland sea. And so just in that time window, I want to show you what happened. So I'm going to show you some pictures. This is the Aral Sea in the year 2000. These are pictures taken from space. And if you watch some of the videos with Colonel Chris Hadfield from the International Space Station, he specifically talks about this. And I want to highlight that little line on the outer part. Okay, that's that green kind of lighter colored line that's outside of the actual sea is the approximate shoreline in 1960. So in the 40 years between 1960 and 2000, you have seen already a decline of that particular body of water. Okay, due to human use, withdrawals from that system, and due to things like climate change. So let's go ahead and step through time. So this is 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. At this point, they recognized that they needed to do something, otherwise they were going to lose the lake. So they tried other diversion programs to try and put water back into the Aral Sea. And you see it goes back up. But unfortunately, that's not the end of it because it starts to go ahead and decline once again. But even though the water level goes up here, people still need water, especially if you're going to add farmland to areas where really it wasn't sustainable to have farmland. And in 2011, you see it go down. So once again, they begin trying to pump water back in, okay, divert it from other places, goes back up, only to go back down again. And by the year 2014, you'll notice that it's almost completely gone in the major section of it. Okay, let's do another diversion plan. We'll bring in more water. And if history teaches us anything, we bring in more water. What do we go ahead and do with it? Use it up again. And so you're going to see this kind of seesaw method happening where we put more in and we take more out. But ultimately, this is a dying sea. And what's left behind is not great land, especially since we're looking at farming and you have things like agricultural runoff. So this is what the sea looked like in 1976. And this is an incredibly visual example of degradation of natural capital. Remember that the Aral Sea was once the fourth largest freshwater lake in the world. Since 1960, it has been shrinking and getting saltier and saltier because most of the water from the rivers that replenish it has been diverted to grow cotton and food crops. The satellite photos that I've been showing you in the sea from 1976 to 2006, it has split into two major parts, the little Aral on the left and the big Aral on the right. And as the lake shrank, it left behind a very salty desert, economic ruin, and increasing health problems with severe ecological disruption. So, what do you think should be done to help prevent further shrinkage of the Aral Sea? There's that picture from 2014. And that's a huge difference in terms of how much water, and look at the color too. I mean, the water is just not as clean as it once was. If you were to actually go to the shores of the Aral Sea right now, this is what you're going to see. Okay. So, how do we deal with this depletion of our fresh water, especially when we start looking at depletion of groundwater, which we rely so heavily upon to recharge our surface water? Well, ultimately, we need to prevent waste. So we need to use water more efficiently. And the best way to do this is to raise the price of water. Because if the water costs more, you are not as likely to waste it. Okay. We need to subsidize water conservation. We need to tax water that's pumped from wells near the surface water and use that to help pay to protect it. We need to limit the number of wells that are drilled and build rain gardens in urban areas to help salvage and save water. Because it turns out that the land is the best filter for that water we could find. It's cheaper and more efficient than anything we as humans have built. And we need to stop growing water intensive crops in dry areas. I hate to say this, but we start looking at places like Nevada, Arizona. These were never meant to be big crop growing areas. Nature was not set up that way. And the fact that we do try and farm these areas, that's working against nature. You know, if you think about our agroecology we talked about before, this is never going to be self sufficient. The number of inputs needed to make this successful is incredibly high. So, how can we increase freshwater supplies? Well, groundwater for food production and use by cities is being pumped from aquifers faster than it can be replenished by nature. And although dam and reservoir systems and water transfer projects have expanded water distribution, they also have a huge impact on ecosystems and they also displace people. I mean, China is a great example of this. And a lot of countries are looking more and more at desalination as a fix all for this, but it's still really expensive. And so we need to come up with a better version if we're going to try and hope to use this in the future. We in Oregon are a good example of a place that has used dams to try and capture and best utilize our water. We use it for drinking water, we also use it for electricity, and there are advantages of dams and water transfer projects. These dam and reservoir systems can capture and store surface runoff from a river's watershed. This water is then released as needed to control upstream flooding, generate electricity, supply fresh water, and provide recreational opportunities. And water transfer projects can use dams and pumps and aquifers to transfer water from areas that are rich in water to areas that are water poor. So there's some equity here too in being able to utilize these dam systems. But for all of the benefits of it, there are also disadvantages. Dams and reservoir systems displace millions of people, flood productive lands, impair the ecosystem services of rivers, and have a useful life expectancy of only about 50 years, at which point they need to be either rebuilt, reconditioned, or taken down. Water transfer projects reduce a river's flow and flushing action, which leads to an increase in pollution. threaten fisheries, and artificially cheapen the cost of water, leading to inefficient and wasteful water use. Now, I have a little video here that I want you guys to go ahead and watch that talks about a river close to us, okay, and the impact of the dams. So go ahead and watch this, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
If you think about the way a river works in a landscape, it essentially functions as the circulatory system. It drains the waste products off of the land. And that sediment is the stuff that basically structures habitat in rivers, and then once it gets to the coast, it builds beaches. It creates the offshore environments. That flow of material is incredibly important ecologically, and building dams disrupts that. But there's another aspect to rivers in terms of flow back upstream that most people don't tend to think about. And in the Northwest, that's greatly mediated by salmon. Because when salmon leave their native streams, they're little fish. When they come back a couple years later, they're huge. They put on like 90%, 95% of their body mass in the marine environment. And what that essentially means is that a large fish run, the kind of fish runs we had historically in the Northwest, you can view as a nitrogen pump that's basically scavenging food out of the oceans and bringing it back on land. It feeds the bugs, the trees in the forest, they feed the eagles, they feed the bears, essentially fertilizing their own world. Anything that blocks a river, like a dam does, limit their access to part of the world that they need to complete their life cycle.
The 4 dams in the Snake River in the upper reaches of the Columbia Basin are a clear overshoot, and they are, in my judgment, largely responsible for the destruction of the salmon runs that we used to see all the way up into the Rocky Mountains in Idaho.
The Snake River Basin holds today the largest intact remaining set of pristine salmon habitat left in the lower 48. We're talking over 5,000 miles of stream habitat in central Idaho alone. If we took out the 4 lower Snake River dams, salmon and steelhead would have access back into all those areas.
There should not be 4 dams on the lower Snake River, choking out the most important, wildest salmon refuge left. 5,500 miles of high elevation streams, more resistance to global warming than any other watershed. If the salmon runs were restored, that would be the jumping off point to this unbelievable wilderness nexus that is really one of the most beautiful places in the world.
Dams change the habitat. When you disturb the habitat, it can be detrimental to the native fishes and beneficial to non-native fishes. The river is no longer a river, it's a lake, and the lakes are full of predators that like nothing better than to eat a nice young salmon smoke. The Pacific Northwest right now, according to the Oregonian newspaper, spends $1 billion a year on salmon recovery, and they're not getting very much for it. There are study after study now that are showing that hatcheries present on a river reduce the survival of the wild fish.
The primary purpose for these dams always was transportation. It was to make Lewiston, Idaho a seaport.
The only reason it's just slightly cheaper to send wheat down the river rather than putting it on the railroad, which runs right along the river corridor, is because of the subsidies. Given the fiscal condition of this country, the budget issues, now's the time simply to remove that subsidy, and you'll find the wheat growers doing very well on the railroad.
A dam is a means to an end, and we've got it the other way around now. We look at them as end states. They're built, they're there, they're going to stay there forever. And their intent was to increase the economic output of a region in the country. And so when they stop doing that, they're no longer viable. A lot of the work that we've done on the economics and costs shows that if you keep the dams, the national economy is losing at least $150 million a year. These 4 dams are really expensive to operate. And the minute they diverge from that end state that you're after, you ought to look at them as wait, we need another tool here. Is it wind energy? Is it solar panels? Let's look at this as a means, not an end.
The beautiful thing about salmon is that if you look at their history, they're incredibly resilient. I mean, if you give them half a chance, they can come back.
When you remove the dam and the river becomes a river again, the complexity begins to reappear.
There's a ripple effect of restoration that moves all the way through the river basin, all the way upstream.
Removal of the lower Snake River dams is one of the big jewels embedded in the holy grail of salmon recovery.
This would be the biggest watershed restoration in North America, if not on Earth, if we did this.
It's the largest possible salmon recovery venture of which humanity is capable, would be simply the removal of those 4 dams.
So is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? We have to start thinking about what is the benefit in terms of sustainability with all the different pieces in mind. Is this good socially? Is this good economically? Is this good environmentally? And from what we're seeing to these days, especially with respect to the snake, is that it's not meeting any of those goals. And so why are we continuing to do it? Because we have subsidies paying to keep it just barely cheaper than the railroads in terms of moving wheat. We've got to reevaluate that. And we're not the only place that's dealing with dam issues. Okay. The Ataturk Dam project in eastern Turkey. Okay, you can see how much land was covered up by the dam. Okay, that's land that could have been used to grow food. There are people that live there that were displaced by that dam. How much water is it producing? How effective is that? We have to look at all those different pieces in terms of how effective is it at meeting its goals. This is the 3. You see one of them down here in the lower right-hand corner. And then what happens over time, you can see the body of water up at the top left is big watch points, the lifespan on these things, barring any years. And if you do have these major earthquake events, I know that they were looking at some of these in the Himalayas to try and get hydroelectric power out of those. And these are areas that have a lot of earthquake activity. And so you're in much higher risk of flooding downstream when you start looking at these. So it's a trade-off. There are benefits, but there are definitely drawbacks. And so we have to decide if those benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Okay. When you go and take a look at some of the benefits, it provides irrigation water above and below the dam, provides water for drinking, reservoir use for recreation and fishing, and can produce relatively cheap electricity through hydropower, reducing downstream flooding of cities and farms, depending on how we use it. But we have flooded land that destroys forests or cropland and displaces people. You have large losses of water through evaporation. deprives downstream croplands and estuaries of their nutrient-rich silt, and especially in places like the Nile River, that was heavily relied upon for all of those growers in the Nile River Delta. Okay. And so we really have to think about this in terms of its effect. And so we have this risk of failure at any time, especially in those areas that have high, earthquake activity. And then lastly, you definitely are disrupting migration and spawning of fish like we saw in the video with respect to the salmon. Okay. So is it worth it? Is it not? I think the jury's still out, but there are definitely probably too many, especially on the Snake River, as we saw in that video. Here's an aerial view of Glen Canyon Dam. This crosses the Colorado River and produces Lake Powell, which is one of the biggest areas. The other one that we see here is Lake Mead. I don't have pictured here, but those provide a ton of the water for the U.S. Southwest. I think like Las Vegas wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for the diversion from the Colorado River that exists in these reservoirs. Okay. And as we saw with our case study and talked about last class, the flow of the Colorado River has dropped dramatically. Okay. Once they completed the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, the second one was completed in 1963, you can see how low the flow is in terms of billions of cubic meters of water. And you've had wetter years, as you can see in the late 80s, but you're never even close to your historic levels of water in terms of how much water is flowing through the Colorado River. And again, that's due to human use and need and pumping it out to go ahead and fertilize, to water crops in places like Arizona and Nevada that really probably shouldn't be growing much. So we're seeing some rivers run dry and some lakes shrink. Dams are disrupting hydrologic cycles. Major rivers are running dry at least part of the year. We've got the Colorado we've been talking about, but the Rio Grande. In China, you've got the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. In India, you've got the Indus. In Europe, you've got the Danube. In Egypt, you've got the Nile River up through Lake Victoria. In fact, there's lots of political unrest surrounding the Nile River and a potential dam in Ethiopia. Lake Chad in Africa is disappearing completely. And so a lot of people may say, that's like, oh, well, let's just move water from somewhere else. But is transferring water from one place to another really the answer? It can increase the water supply in some areas, but it also disrupts other ecosystems. We've done this for a long time through tunnels, aqueducts, underground water pipes. This is a central piece to the California Water Project and Central Arizona Water Projects. As you can see here, these projects involve large-scale water transfers from one watershed to another. Arrows show the general direction of water flow. You can kind of see here, San Joaquin Valley, that's a big one we talked about. Okay. You've got water from the Colorado that's going into Lake Mead, and that's being pumped to go ahead and provide most of the water for the state of Nevada. Tucson, Phoenix, these are dry areas that have pretty big populations that we need to go ahead and provide drinking water for. And so it has to be pumped there because there is no natural water source to provide for that many people. So we have some issues moving forward that we're going to have to deal with in terms of how we provide the water needed by the populations that live in these areas that really were never meant to support as many people as they now do. Okay. And then you got to think about, people watering their lawn, and is that really a feasible exercise in terms of best using the available water that we have? So there's a lot to keep in mind as we go ahead and start thinking about how we utilize the fresh water that we have. And because of the disparities in terms of availability, we're starting to see that scarcity stress on certain areas. And so there potentially could be future wars over water in the not too distant future of our planet. Okay, guys, that's what I've got for you today. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow or see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.